Daniel, can I have a... Oh, ladies and gentlemen, if we could make our way through, there are still some seats available, some of which are temporarily occupied by bags, because this isn't London Underground. There's at least one lovely position right at the front in the middle for someone who wants to ask questions or doesn't mind being sort of... Well, I'll do like 3 minutes of intro and then you'll be straight in. Well, it's very good to see that we've actually got more people than we've got chairs at the start of the meeting. Hello, Paul. How are you? Yeah, nice to see you too, mate. Okay. Nearly there? Pretty much everybody? Okay. Right, we'll let's begin. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending. I realise it's an exceptional effort these days for people to come to the centre of London and take time out of your schedules to join us. And it genuinely is appreciated to make the Get Ahead event a success. For those who are not so familiar, this event, you know, the Institute of Sound Communication Video Engineers, it's an example for us to, an opportunity for us to allow people to talk about some developments in our industry. Today we're going to have 3 sessions. The first session is going to be conducted by Tony Smith here, who's going to be talking about implications and changes in the BS5839, the voice alarm code of practice. The second session is going to be run by James from Ampetronic at the back there, who's going to be talking about Auracast and similar technology types. And then the the third session, I'm afraid, is going to be done by me, which is actually going to be talking about the registered installers scheme that we are starting at the ISCVE right about now. In between each session, there will be a comfort break, and at the end of the third session, there will be lunch. We're not doing lunch before I speak because I know you will all just have sandwiches and leave. So we're holding that to the end. And so don't think there's anything much more to say again other than thanks for coming, and I shall pass you over to Tony for the first of our sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. On to the, sorry. The slideshow isn't working. So,
Bear with.
I scrolled through some stuff earlier, but...
You've got your notes, yeah?
Yep. So...
Oh, so you want it as a slideshow? Or
Yeah,
use
yeah.
a slideshow?
Use slideshow. Okay.
Okay, you're happy?
Thank you. Sorry, this is the slideshow view, not the notes and slideshow. It's extenders. It's a MacBook, not a laptop, so I'm lost. Here we go. All yours. Great. Technology, eh? I'm used to, not used to Mac, so. Right, my name's Anthony Smith. I'm Managing Director of Voce. I'm also the past president of this institute. I'm chair of the BSI FSH 12.5 committee that's responsible for alarms, evacuation and emergency voice communication. Part of that is I'm a member of TC 72 Working Group 3 and 23. Working Group 3 deals with sounders and VADs, 23 deals with voice alarm and loudspeakers. Also, I'm a member of the ISO TC21SC3, and that covers the ISO 7240 series of standards which mirror the EM54 series. I'm also a member of EPL 100, which this group has quite a lot of representation in, which deals with 6259, 7827 and 63079, the IEC for induction loops. So as part of FSH 12.5, we cover voice alarm and voice evacuation. And we're also responsible for the UK's input to TC72, the maintenance of the codes of practice 5839 Part 8 and Part 9, and maintenance of a new UK specification, which is 8893, which is the emergency voice communication standard. Specification, sorry. Right, the scope of 5839 has not changed. What has happened is it's been slightly reworded to follow new guidelines that BSI brought in, and it has been made more English. I think that's the easiest way of saying it. It was a pretty poorly worded document. What were the reasons for change? Well, partly quite a lot of input was put in from the ISCVE, or the ISCE at the time, about inconsistencies in the standard. This is a full editorial change in line with the new BSI guidance. It removes additional product requirements that are not in EM5416 because we're not allowed to have them. It enforces requirements for loudspeakers conforming to EM5424. It provides additional information on accessibility provision there. Technical changes, including changing Annex C from informative to normative. Provides additional clarification on verification. The verification clause in Part 8 was all over the place. And it adds additional requirements for documentation and maintenance of the system. In summary, there are editorial changes, accessibility changes, technical changes, and changes to verification and maintenance. I've got a full list of the changes here. Ros can issue them to people who want at the end. Okay? I don't really want to go through death by PowerPoint with that. Right, I'll go through the standard now in order of the clauses because that's the easiest way of covering it. So in the terms and definitions, we've removed a lot of unused definitions, and the term acoustically distinguishable area, which was brought in from 7240 Part 19, has now been replaced with acoustically distinguishable space because it's 3D, not 2D. Types of voice alarm system. This section gives an overview of voice alarm systems and sets the parameter for the system designer and offers 5 classes of voice alarm. It now makes it clear that a V2 system can have more than one all-call emergency microphone. That was a bit woolly in the last version. Phased evacuation classes V3, V4 and V5 now have a new requirement added to ensure that the evacuate message, the alert message and the emergency microphone can all broadcast simultaneously. So there's no interruption of messages in areas that aren't being paged to. So if you've got alert on the 3rd floor, evacuate on the 4th floor, with the 2-channel system, it would cut out the alert message when you page the 3rd floor. That's not acceptable. That's particularly important for relay switch systems. Next, we have the exchange of information and responsibilities. The first one is a bit of a nonsensical one, but the designer should ascertain, where practical, if changes to the building are planned, as in you're asking to survey the building, is it going to change before the voice alarm is implemented? Additional hazards other than fire should be distinct. What that means is bomb alert needs to be preceded with a different sequence of tones to alert and evacuate so people know it's a different emergency. Consultations should take place at the design stage between the relevant interested parties, the user or the purchaser, consultants including architects, M&E and acoustic consultants and fire engineering consultants, and of course the designer. If the designer is making the proposal for the type of vase, it should be agreed between the designer and the purchaser. Additional hazards other than fire should be distinct. Before an order is placed for the voice alarm, responsibility for the following stages should be clearly defined and documented: the design, the installation, commissioning, acceptance if it's required, and verification if applicable. Consultation should also take place at the installation stage between the relevant interested parties, the purchaser, the consultants, the acoustic consultants and the designer. And more importantly, if it's a bit of a weirdo, the manufacturer of the vase. One organisation, typically the fire detection alarm installer, should take overall responsibility for the total system formed by the integration of the vase into the fire alarm system. The fire detection and alarm supplier could subcontract the voice alarm and an audio specialist. The link between the fire detection and fire alarm system and the voice alarm system is vital to maintain the integrity of the overall operation. It is important that alarm messages which have been initiated by the fire detection system continue to be broadcast even in the event of this link being broken. It might be desirable on larger voice alarms or where distributed control equipment is used to provide a link at more than one location rather than rely on a central location. In complex installations, it may be possible for distributed detection systems to issue conflicting information. It is important that the possibility and consequences of such faults can be carefully analysed at the design stage and measures taken to mitigate them. To maintain the integrity of the fire alarm, it is important that the wiring be arranged such that a single fault on the wiring does not disable the interface between the two. This is usually provided with a single set of loop-driven interfaces protected against short circuits directly connected and adjacent to the Voce, or by using two diversely routed cables such that a fault on one does not cause a fault on the other. Clause 10 covers monitoring and indication of various cables external to the Voce. And one thing we did notice as a committee, there are far too many jobs where it's specified for 2 circuits for every voice alarm zone. That's not what 5839 has ever said, Part 8 has ever said. It's only for areas over 4,000 metres square or 500 members of the public. If you do meet those criteria, then multiple loudspeakers are used. They should be diversely routed and interleaved such that failure of one circuit will only drop the coverage by 3 dB. What it says about the voice alarm coverage is that the simplest voice alarm must have 2 circuits, and this is where the confusion has come from. One covering the entrance to the fire panel, the entrance way in the fire panel, one covering the rest of the building, so that if you get a fault within the building that disables a voice alarm, people entering the building know there's an issue, an evacuation. There are also people with hearing conditions such as hypercorsis, which is the sensitivity to ultrasonic tones or subharmonics, which are often used for impedance monitoring loudspeaker lines. So we put another clause in saying it's advisable to keep these tones as low as possible while maintaining the monitoring function because it affects these people. Loudspeaker zones. It is recommended that additional VAD warning devices are fitted for people who are deaf or hearing impaired in areas where they might be alone, such as sanitary accommodation or bedroom accommodation. Where these warning devices are provided within loudspeaker zones, they should be activated when an emergency message is broadcast on that zone. That includes a live voice message, so that you don't have the situation the VADs are on the fire alarm, you make a manual all-call emergency announcement, the VADs don't go off. It's no use to the people in the area. In areas where an EVC system, especially stairwells, and to clarify this, when I gave this presentation to a colleague yesterday, after I'd submitted it, he pointed out that what do you class, where do you put these? And a stairwell is a vertical evacuation zone. Because when you're evacuating, you don't want people walking down between, they're walking, their floor says evacuate, they come down a floor, it says alert. What do? So it's got to be a vertical evacuation zone. That's not changed in any version of Part 8, but it's badly worded. In those areas, typically EVC, emergency voice communication systems, are placed on the stairs. And we've got this new clause where what was originally intended was just placing VADs. The fire alarm people didn't like that. So we come to a compromise so that the attention drawing signal should be no more than 50 dBA at speech, and speech broadcasts no more than 56 dBA, measured 1 metre from the outstation or the master station to prevent it interfering with the EVCS system. This is a new clause which is brought in by the ISCVE. It covers buildings which provide an assistive listening systems and recommends that they be integrated in with the voice alarm. That includes induction loop, infrared and radio Auracast. It also asks the designer to consider whether fitting an ALS, assistive listening system, could benefit as part of the voice alarm if the building doesn't have one. An override should be provided on the assistive listening system to mute non-emergency inputs while the emergency broadcast is being made. In simple acoustic spaces, loudspeakers can be placed as per this prescriptive method, as on a 6-metre grid. The only change that has been made is the distance distance between the loudspeaker and the listener has been changed from 6 meters to 4.5 meters. That's in line with ISO TR 5432. Basically, you could have the situation where if it's 6 meters from the speaker, you could put a single speaker in a room 12 meters by 12 meters, which will not work. Where loudspeakers breach a fire-resisting barrier, this should not compromise the performance of the fire-resisting barrier, and it's the usual case. Specialist advice should be sought if you don't know. Loudspeakers that require equalization to achieve the bandwidth required by EN 5424 should be placed on their own dedicated loudspeaker circuit and provided with the necessary equalization. Necessary equalization is usually described on the certificate or data sheet. Voice sounders. Normally they're limited to type 1 voice alarms. It is common for fire alarm installers to install voice sounders in a similar way to regular sounders. This normally affects the intelligibility, particularly in larger rooms. In spaces such as open plan offices, the intelligibility achieved from wall-mounted voice sounders might not be acceptable. It might be necessary to install voice sounders on the ceilings to achieve the coverage. If a voice sounder is to be used for voice alarm live broadcasts, then it should conform to EN 54.3, the sounder standard, 16, the Voce standard, and 24, the loudspeaker standard. Power amplifier reliability. Power amplifiers designed and built to EN 5416 offer a high degree of reliability when properly installed and maintained, and so are not expected to fail. It is therefore considered unnecessary to fit a standby amplifier or redundant amplifiers, as it will only affect one zone and a fault would be reported. You do not have standby loop drivers on the fire alarm. If hot standby is fitted, the user gets no loss of performance, meaning they don't call service till a second failure occurs, and then it's a bigger problem. In my 32 years experience, it's the cables that fail, not the amplifiers. Typically, still saws are involved. It requires you to do a risk assessment, and the risk assessment is very simple. Will it affect more than one area? Where the amplifier covers more than one zone, parallel banked or relay switched, then it will be necessary. When you're doing your design, the size of the amplifier shall be 20% greater than the initial speaker design. Ambient noise sensing. In certain buildings, it may be appropriate to use ANS to adjust the volume of the voice alarm according to the amount of ambient noise at any time. ANS can be used to advantage in spaces that are subject to significant variations in ambient noise levels, such as airports and railway concourses. ANS is not essential for emergency broadcasts. However, it may reduce the unwanted overspill to adjacent zones and subsequently improve intelligibility in partly occupied, highly reverberant spaces. ANS can be used to provide a comfortable, intelligible listening level and reduce the noise pollution to occupants and local residents. Sorry, getting lost. Emergency microphones. The main change to this clause was the additional requirements for compression and limiting over and above EN 5416. Most manufacturers put it in anyway, but you're not allowed in a code of practice locally to override or add additional information or requirements over EN5416. And also, smartphones or telephones cannot be used as inputs, emergency inputs to the voice alarm or to control automatic messages, as they're not certified to EN5416 and may cause other issues. Live and pre-recorded messages need to be immediately recognised as such, so that appropriate action can be taken without delay. It is therefore important that measures are taken to draw attention to the urgency by means of an attention drawing signal. This signal needs to draw the attention of the listener to the message that follows. Care should be taken that the amplitude of this tone does not mask the intelligibility of the following message, and therefore we now recommend it should be 6 dB below to prevent the ear from hardening. In certain circumstances, phased evacuation being one of them, where two different emergency messages may be heard at the same time, a different voice, such as a male voice for the evacuate or a female voice for the alert, should be used, so you can also tell when the state in an area changes. Keep messages short and concise. People bore easily. It is essential that emergency messages are intelligible. Training is necessary for those delivering live emergency messages, particularly in the correct use of microphone, and with purposeful intonation, an emergency message can help convey the desired urgency or alternatively provide a calming influence. In the past, conventional wisdom was that the occurrence of a fire be kept concealed from the public, as it might cause panic. This practice is now debunked because it's been shown that if people are given accurate information, they are less likely to panic and more likely to behave as required. Moreover, they are less likely to waste time trying to determine the cause of an unspecified need to evacuate. On this basis, it is now considered the use of the word fire in the evacuation broadcast is likely to be a benefit. Here is the 5839 evacuate message. Consists of an attention grabbing tone between 2 and 10 seconds, and then 2 seconds of silence to allow the ringing to die down in reverberant spaces. Attention please, fire has been reported in the building. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit. Do not use the lift. And then a 2-second silence to allow that to die down, and then repeat. As you can see from this, the alert tone or attention grabbing tone is 6 dB below the peak of the speech. That's something Peter Barnett was going on about at 92's Windermere Convention, where Paul and I met. It was a particularly one of those things where he was saying that people who the attention grabbing tone is at full amplitude, you then can't determine the first 2 or 3 seconds of speech afterwards because your ears have hardened. And you can also pick out a tone in a lot less signal to noise ratio than you can speech. So therefore it makes sense to do it. This is by far the most contentious change, mostly because fire alarm engineers don't understand sound. The attention drawing tone is a minimum 60 dB or 5 dB above background noise, but the peaks in the speech are obviously 6 dB higher. This is also 70 dB for the attention-grabbing tone in sleeping accommodation. Therefore, the speech is 76 dB. Typically, to achieve this, you require a speaker in the room. All measurements should be taken with the doors shut. Clause 20, intelligibility, has been substantially rewritten and now gives the designer and installer firm guidance on the placement of loudspeakers to achieve acceptable intelligibility, which is the whole point of a voice alarm. It explains how computer modelling is only as good as the assumptions the designer makes. So is only a guide, it's not carte. The clause also explains when the designer should seek professional help with the loudspeaker design and placement. It also explains subjective and objective measurement of intelligibility and the number of data points to be assessed. It requires that there should be a signal to noise ratio of at least 10 dB. Noise should be measured using LAEQT over a minimum of 60 seconds. A competent person should carry out these assessments, and the assessment should be carried out at emergency broadcast level. Objective intelligibility is described in 60268-16, and guidance is given on subjective intelligibility assessment, and it should be carried out on all emergency messages, not just one. This clause used to be called networking in the previous version, 2013. It's now been renamed to distributed systems, so it's technology neutral, because it went on a lot about Ethernet and lag and whatever. Distributed systems are typically installed in the following circumstances: where the VAS is large and beyond the capability of a single Voce, where the Voce cannot be accommodated in one equipment room due to space or ventilation limitations, to avoid a single point of failure on the system, to reduce the cross-sectional area and number of cables required between the Voce and loudspeakers, where there is a need for monitoring or control of a number of VAS in different buildings in the same vicinity, such as an industrial site. The effect of a failure of this communication link and the implications for VAS operation depends on the configuration of the distributed VAS and the technology used, and whether it forms part of the critical signal path. The standard recommends ring or loop networks, which are more resilient to communication failures than a radial type network, and peer-to-peer networks, which are less vulnerable to loss of function than networks with a central processor controlling equipment-to-equipment communications. Don't put the distributed part of the Voce in a stupid place. It still requires maintenance. Another new clause, cybersecurity. Some Voces have the ability to be remotely monitored via modem or internet, which allows the manufacturer or service provider to remotely interrogate the system. Interrogate the system, incorporate the system into a graphical user interface, fault diagnose or alter and amend the system God dear. However, such connectivity can be attacked with the aim of gaining access to the system and potentially to the wider network within a building. Cybersecurity is the process of protecting networks, devices and data from unauthorized access or criminal use. A risk assessment needs to be performed on the impact of remote changes or services, and it is recommended that somebody be on site to verify and test after a remote alteration. So you may not know how to do all the widdly bits, but you need somebody on site to test that you haven't broken anything. Power supplies. The main change in this area is to do with the calculation of the battery capacity, which is Annex C, which we'll come to later. Standby generators, generator changeover should not affect the Voce as it's certified to EN54, but this is to cover the ancillary items that are also included in the voice alarm, which may be susceptible. Electrical safety. This part of it has been massively simplified and the drawings telling you how to earth things have been removed. The VAS is a particular type of electrical installation, much of which operates on extra low voltage, but some of it operates on low voltage, such as the loudspeakers and the main supplies. The low voltage directive requires manufacturers to specify the earthing requirement, not a standard. An isolating switch is now required at each cabinet, and the labelling of all protected devices and isolators in the supply chain is as before. Verification. This clause has been massively simplified and covers when an end user or purchaser of a system may require verification to this part of 5839 or specific parts of it. The person doing the verification should be competent and familiar with the standard. For certain, usually large or complex voice alarms, the purchaser or user may wish to arrange for verification or conformity to this part of 5839. This is typically as a result of one or more of the following: the division of the work elements between different organisations, the evolution of the building design during construction, the lack of any detailed information at the time of the design. The verifying organisation might be one of those involved in the design, supply, installation or commissioning processes, for example the supplier or the designer, or an independent third party. In the event that the verification process identifies areas of non-conformity, the purchaser or user might request further verification once those affected areas have been corrected. On completion, a verification certificate should be issued. Inspection 6 monthly. Clause 40 details the required checks every 6 months and yearly. This has been simplified, but additional requirements have been added. The inspection should survey the site for the erection of new or relocated structures that would affect intelligibility or audibility. Any changes to the use or occupancy of an area make the existing loudspeaker design unsuitable, such as an increase in ambient noise or any building alterations and extensions that require additional loudspeakers or voice alarm equipment. Any structural or occupancy changes found in accordance with the above items should be reported to premises management so that corrective works can be commissioned. Every 6 months, you should conduct the following checks within the service. Check all microphones. Set off at least one fire alarm and check audibility and intelligibility. Check that the battery temperature is within manufacturer's specifications. If they cook, they die. Test at least one of each fault type, speakers, so on. Test all ancillary functions and overrides. Test all Voce indicators and controls and any other manufacturer recommended tests. Servicing 12 monthly. This should include all of the 6 monthly checks plus the following. All automatic fire alarm inputs should be operated to check that the correct messages broadcast to the correct areas are audible, intelligible, and that cause, effect or phased evacuation programming responds as expected. In some cases, it might be appropriate to measure the sound pressure levels, for example, if there's reason to suspect they may have changed. For some installations, equipment isolation may be required. It may therefore be beneficial for the fire detection and alarm company to maintain their part at the same time as the Voce maintenance, so that appropriate tests can be performed without unnecessary disturbance. All manual initialization inputs for emergency recorded messages should be operated to check the messages broadcast to the correct areas and are audible and intelligible. Any cause and effect or phased evacuation programming responds as expected. During the tests described above, and where practical, all loudspeakers should be checked for their correct operation and, where appropriate, orientation. Where practical, all loudspeakers should be visually examined for damage. All loudspeaker circuit impedances should be measured and compared with the previous year's measurements, ideally using the same calibrated test equipment. Any deviation should be investigated. Defects need to be placed in the logbook and reported to premises management. Annex A gave guidance on target design levels and occupational noise levels. These have been substantially reviewed and altered to more realistic real-world figures. This is one of the big changes. The annex has been changed from informative to normative, so it's now part of the standard. The 1/8 power comes from the measurement. 2 experiments were done. One was the measurement of temperature rise of a sine wave into a heatsink, and the same equivalent rise for the evacuate message that I showed earlier into the same load, and the measurement of acoustic power and of sine wave power mathematically. So Peter Mapp did the acoustic tests, I did the physical tests. We both came to a figure of 10.2% difference between a sine wave and a speech message. So the 1/8 power, or 12.5%, which is also used when EMC testing and low voltage directive testing, was deemed a good safety margin on the figures. So what you have is the first line of the battery equation is as it was. The second line, IA, which is the amplifier power, is the power of the speakers divided by the battery voltage times the amplifier efficiency. And that's important whether it's class AB or class D. So the full load current is classed as the quiescent current plus any VAD or fire alarm device current plus the amplifier current divided by 8. And therefore you need much smaller batteries for systems, and as we found, the design around the sound power go on for hours longer, and that's more environmentally friendly and better for what you do. So, any questions?
That's just a quick question on the use of ANS in a voice alarm system.
Yep.
'Cause I've always kind of been under the impression that voice in a evacuation scenario, the ambient noise sensing gets bypassed, and in my view, sensibly so, because there could be, is the ambient noise sensing specifically dynamic, or does it have to be dynamic?
It's only guidance. So you can only apply ambient noise sensing to paging and background music, or you can apply it to paging, background music and emergency. It really does depend on the intelligibility you achieve in the area. So if you've got an area that's empty, very reverberant, and you're pumping an evacuation message out and it's clearly unintelligible, then you need ambient noise sensing when you're broadcasting the emergency message as well as the other messages. But if it doesn't affect that, you don't. It's really the designer's responsibility for how they do it.
Thank you very much. That was a very useful summary. The bit about the speech intelligibility, and you talk about the background noise being measured as an LAQ, and we used to have, and maybe we still do have, a statement that the background noise you're designed to is the noise likely to be exceeded by 30 seconds or more, which seems to be sensible. Is that no longer the case, or is it just an LAQ of 60 seconds and that's it?
I point. Yeah.
Because the 30 seconds or more makes sense. Because yeah, okay.
But successfully passed. Unfortunately, the acoustic section was Tony Stacey and Peter Mapp. So us fire and voice alarm engineers kept out of it.
Work out if the 30 seconds is still in there, because that seems to be a sensible way of talking about what your background noise is. It's actually a sustained noise rather than incidental noises. Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing is about insisting on 10 dB signal to noise. Surely the speech intelligibility requirement trumps that, which sometimes needs more, obviously, but also can also be achieved with less. Sometimes less is only the practical thing, like on a football pitch, for example.
It says at least.
Yeah, that's a problem. Some places you won't get 10, but you'll still get the intelligibility by other methods.
Again, that's down to the whole point of the system is to give intelligible messages.
Yes, of course.
And so the main part of knowing whether commissioning it is doing the STI tests.
Absolutely.
When it is a complex space.
So you can achieve that without necessarily having to have the 10 dB signal tonight. So to have that as an additional overriding requirement seems an unnecessary implication.
Again, that was the acoustician who put that in.
All right, that's my question.
That's a headline figure.
Quick one for me was regards to the pre-warning alert tones. Is there any kind of like prescriptive frequencies at all?
It recommends it should be around 1 kilohertz and it should be a 2 or 3 tone sequence.
Okay, yeah, so ideally on the harmonics presumably as well, if there's background noise that happens to mask that particular tone sort of thing.
And also you can change the frequency of the attention grabbing tone if there's other noise in the building which consequently affects that.
Influence it as well, sort of thing. So okay, cool, that's one. Thank you.
Mine is on a similar line as well, to do with the measurement of the actual tone, because you're saying it's going to be measured LEQ, but obviously if it's a tone, it doesn't really matter if you're only measuring the tone. But are you really asking that the tone be measured and then subsequently the voice section be measured LEQ to prove that that's 6 dB above the tone?
No.
No.
What fire alarm engineers tend to do is do the assessment on the tone. That's why it's specifically done out. And it's not LEQ 10 or LEQ whatever. It's slow averaging noise meter.
Yeah, okay, so it's whoever made the message in the first place will be looking to make the 6 dB difference, etc. on the voice.
Yeah, I mean, basically, when you're normalising the message, one thing we assumed, which was always the cock-up in these things, is that people understood what normalizing meant, and they didn't. So normalizing is a function within audio software for increasing the level to the maximum or to a level that you set. And I'm currently going to have to write something for BSI to put out because, and that's part of the slide I put in here, to explain what the normalizing is.
The example you showed us from audition, sorry, there's something there. So the examples you showed us from audition was the 6 dB difference was on the peaks and
Yes.
not on the RMS or the LEQ.
But how can you do it on
No,
the
I agree with
RMS?
that. Yeah, but so it was worth remembering that 6 dB higher on peaks on speeches will be probably lower than equivalent on the LEQ by the time you've
Yeah,
put
but
the
it's
dynamics of the
more
speech
to
in.
get the difference, so it's
Sure.
the speech is louder.
Well, that's my point. It won't necessarily be louder if you measure it as an LEQ just because you've made the peaks 6 dB higher.
I know,
The dynamics
but
of the speech will be much wider than of the tone.
I know. But how do you describe it?
I understand. It's just important to be clear.
Any more questions? Well, so, okay, thank you very much, Tony, for your round of applause, Tony, please.
Thank you.
Sure, that's given everyone a nice intellectual and detailed kind of start for the session with some actual maths appearing on the screen, kind of scary. So in order to help us all recover from that, what we will now do is take a short break, and the next session will start at 12:15, which is in 7 minutes, which is just long enough to grab yourself a coffee and comfort break, and see you back here in 7. Hello. Last few stragglers outside. Okay, we're about to kick off session 2. Actually, I feel a little bit guilty because when I started this morning, I didn't actually welcome all those people who might be joining us online. I believe there were some sort of 30 to 40 people who actually registered to join online. I'm not sure how many of them we've actually got at this time, but hello. Welcome to and just an important point about that is if you do, when asking questions at the end, obviously even though we in the room may be able to hear you, if you're not using the microphone, obviously anyone who's not in the room would genuinely struggle. So if you could make sure we use the microphone for questions at the end, that would be wonderful. And in the meantime, without further ado, James is going to tell us exciting stuff about Auracast.
All right. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to the ISCVE team for the invitation to speak to you today a little bit about Auracast and the role it plays in the future of assistive listening. So without further ado, of course he's going to appear in a random order. Well-polished PowerPoint. So we're going to take a little look, very brief look, just at an overview of, of assistive listening and how effective it is for us. Don't worry, it's going to be very brief. We are assuming a working knowledge of the subject for this session. We're going to talk a bit about user devices because that is really a key part of the Auracast story, certainly for the first few years. Then we're going to look in a bit more detail at Auracast itself, what it is, how it works, and perhaps what the future holds. So without any further ado, a very brief introduction about ourselves. For those who are not familiar, we're a manufacturer primarily of loop products. We also distribute other assistive listening products, infrared, radio-based systems, audio over Wi-Fi. A bit like Tony, we're involved with the standards committees. But because of that background as a loop manufacturer, a technology which ultimately is going to deliver sound direct to hearing aids, but be easier to install than loop, so a kind of, you could see as a loop replacement technology, is of considerable interest. Hence, we're getting involved in that nice and early and speaking for you today. Anyway, enough about us. Let's get on with looking at the topic at hand. So a very brief introduction, just really to counter the point that we still have coming up from time to time where people say, oh, well, hearing aids are so good now, we just don't really need anything else. And we would sort of politely disagree with that point. And we're going to refer to an Audio Engineering Society study from, it is a few years ago now, I think it's 2016, but it's, there haven't been tremendous leaps in hearing aid technology in the meantime. And a group of just under 800 people were asked to rate their listening experience in a series of churches, so relatively difficult listening environments, tricky acoustics, etc. Asked to rate their listening experience using their hearing aid on its own on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being heard nothing, 10 being heard every word. And it's worth noting 2 things here. 1, the average score, if you like, was below 50% listening satisfaction using the hearing aid alone. And really very few people rated their listening experience in the top 30%. So if we come up against a situation where we're perhaps thinking, well, why do we bother anymore? The technology in terms of user devices has moved on so much, we just don't need to bother. It is a few years ago, but I don't think this situation will have dramatically changed. There is still very much a role for assistive listening technology. And sort of prove the point, this same study was repeated, or the same question was repeated, this time using an effective assistive listening system, and the results were quite different. So the act of moving the microphone, or series of microphones, closer to the talker, the basic physics of that operation still outweighs all the ever-advancing trickery that's in hearing aid devices. So I think before we get onto the specifics of Auracast, it was worth just emphasising the point that there is going to be a need for this sort of technology probably forevermore in some form. And I think we've got to talk a little bit before we get onto Auracast itself about the, frankly, mess we increasingly find ourselves in with compatibility with the devices that users will bring to a venue. And I characterise the problem that we have as a manufacturer with a bit of perhaps a caricatured statement. But if we're perhaps at an exhibition and somebody comes to us to talk about the technology options, they might say something a bit like this. And we let out a little bit of a sigh for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not necessarily, well, it's not true, is the first thing to say. And the second is that even if it were true, it would represent a real problem for us. So let's sort of dig into why that might be. Regarding the fitment rate situation, a few details that we've gleaned. It's very hard to get any sort of hard numbers on this topic, but we're in regular touch with hearing aid manufacturers to find out the latest from them on various topics. And something which is I think a key detail is that the vast majority of NHS devices still have a telecoil in some form or another. It might be in an external accessory, but still in the majority of devices, it is physically inside the hearing aid still. Now, whether or not it is software enabled and accessible to the user at the point where they walk out of their audiology appointment is another matter. But I think the good news on that front, I mean, that's not a good situation that people are not necessarily being correctly equipped and correctly advised in our view. But at least that can be quite easily addressed. They can book a replacement appointment and say, I would like my telecoil enabling, please, and maybe give the audiologist a bit of a talking to about why it wasn't done in the first place. But there is perhaps a role for venues in educating users about the options available to them. So that's one thing. We shouldn't conflate it doesn't have a telecoil with it's got a telecoil but it's not switched on. That's an important point. Relatively speaking, Bluetooth audio is fitted in a minority of devices. Now, the telecoil fitment is shrinking over time, and the fitment of Bluetooth audio is growing. So there is an element of truth in the slightly caricatured statement that we saw earlier, but we shouldn't get into sort of panic mode and see a reversal of the true situation. Still today, more devices have telecoils than have Bluetooth audio. And as we'll see in a minute, even if the opposite were true, it would still be bad news. And if we don't have an integrated telecoil, it's often fitted to an accessory device, be that a remote microphone or remote control or some kind of accessory that is supplied with or available as an extra cost option for a hearing aid. So on to Bluetooth itself, and we're going to start talking, I've kind of mentioned it already a couple of times, Bluetooth Classic. This is what the Bluetooth SIG, the Bluetooth organization, are referring to Bluetooth as we know it as, sort of the versions 3 and before. And for our purpose of assistive listening, it has 3 problems, essentially. One is very high power consumption. It eats the battery on the hearing aid at a pretty dramatic rate. You're talking about a fraction of the battery life that you would have using the hearing aid naturally. We see relatively high latency. I believe, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a massive expert on the subject of Bluetooth, I hasten to add, but my understanding is, it depends on the exact version, but you can be looking at 200 or 300 milliseconds of latency in the Bluetooth domain. We'll come back to latency in a minute. But also, it is a paired connection. You pair your phone to your hands-free kit in the car. It's a point-to-point connected link connection. And so if, for example, we're looking at equipping a theatre with a fictitious Bluetooth Classic assistive listening system, that may have to have 200 transmitters built in to be able to make a connected link to a reasonable proportion of the audience in a large venue. And so going back to that point about connected link, we're probably not going to have a situation where we have multiple dozens or hundreds of transmitters. We're talking really about having a man-in-the-middle device that we use to relay through. And the primary method we've been seeing to achieve that is to use a phone as that device and use an audio over Wi-Fi system to provide that relay. But there are a number of problems surrounding audio over Wi-Fi systems, but if we focus on perhaps the most famous one of latency, we've got an issue here that we've got a latency hop in the Wi-Fi domain and inside the phone, and we've got a second one in the Bluetooth domain getting out of the phone. And depending on the power of the phone in question, that could quite easily be north of half a second combined. And we've certainly seen scenarios with older phones where you're looking at more like a second of combined latency. Realistic minimum using Bluetooth Classic is probably about 300 milliseconds. And even if you're using a hardwired connection, it can still be unusable to some users. If you integrate it with Bluetooth Classic, it's another story again. Another option is to use a Bluetooth transmitter dongle, and you could plug that in as if it were headphones to a receiver for loop or infrared or radio or potentially Auracast. But we've got a snag here that we had. We were at an audiology exhibition recently. We did a straw poll, and one manufacturer would allow connection of a third-party device, i.e. something other than a phone. So normally you've got to have the manufacturer's app on the phone, and that manages the connection. So only one manufacturer would allow you to use other device like a transmitter dongle. So it's really quite restrictive, and the performance is potentially very poor for our purpose. And so we've got a number of scenarios where we might see for different types of input options to hearing aids. We might have telecoil, Bluetooth Classic, increasingly Auracast, and in some cases we might actually have no means of getting an external signal in whatsoever. And so if we're advising a venue, we say you may have to have multiple options, either an installed loop or a neck loop for a receiver-based technology, a phone, or maybe for the right device a transmitter dongle, if we're talking about Bluetooth Classic, an Auracast system for Auracast, and if the worst comes to worst, ask somebody to take out their hearing aids and wear headphones, which sounds really draconian and low tech, but my experience has been that actually still that benefit of putting a microphone or series of microphones in a more sensible position and asking the user to abandon the tailored assistance of their hearing aids is still better than using the hearing aids on its own in most situations. Anyway, a little bit of a backstory there about the backstory and perhaps where we are today. It's worth looking briefly at not necessarily what the technologies are, but how it relates to people from a user experience point of view. And we're going to group these into two areas, if you like, those which are receiver-based and those which are receiverless or work on a bring-your-own-device basis. And for a long time, you really had a choice primarily between loop and mainly infrared, maybe a bit of radio. And audio over Wi-Fi is a relatively recent development. obviously Auracast newer still. But there's been a pushback over the years against the receiver-based technologies because users don't like using those receiver devices. Much rather have a bring your own device approach. But I think it's quite well known that Loop can be tricky to install, and hence in certain environments a easier to retrofit receiver-based technology is essentially our only option, or it might be greatly preferable from an installer's point of view. But to sort of labour the point slightly, part of the Audio Engineering Society study we looked at earlier about the sort of user-listener satisfaction, they also looked at preference for system types. Now this sort of predates things like audio over Wi-Fi just about. So it's framed as being loop versus FM/infrared, but I think you could really read this as bring your own device versus receiver-based. And what it's showing is there's a very strong user preference for avoiding having a receiving device. And I think that plays into a key part of the story around how Auracast is going to be beneficial for us in the future. So, having talked about almost everything but the thing I'm here to talk about, we'll move on to look at the main subject at hand. But before we start on that, I have one last slide on something that's not Auracast, because as you may have gathered, that's a recurring theme. And that is to just draw a distinction between Auracast and Bluetooth LE audio. So LE audio is introduced as part of Bluetooth 5.2. Now, I've noticed that in the marketing materials, they don't really sort of say this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it effectively replaces Bluetooth Classic. I don't know if that's a bit of diplomacy for some vendors who are still using Bluetooth Classic as their primary communication method. They don't want to be making them look old-fashioned. But essentially, LE audio does pretty much the same job as Bluetooth Classic. But it does it with two benefits which address two of the issues that we highlighted earlier with Bluetooth Classic. Because LE is low energy. I should have specified that earlier. So Bluetooth low energy audio. I believe off the top of my head, we're looking at around about a quarter of the power consumption like for like. So it has a considerable impact on the battery life of the device. And the smaller the device, hearing aid being a really good example, the more important that is. And secondly, it uses a new codec, which is high speed and as a result dramatically improves the latency. I think we're looking in the order of 10% of the latency that we would see with Bluetooth Classic. And it's also worth mentioning, doing this slightly out of sequence, that LE audio has had hearing aids as a key use case pretty much from day one. That is, in terms of audio devices, one of the classes of device that is most power sensitive. And so use for hearing assistance purposes, not necessarily for our sort of broadcast assistive listening environment, but for allowing better access to audio from hearing aids has been a key consideration from day one. But LE audio, that is really an equivalent to Bluetooth as we know it. It is still a connected link approach. Auracast is built on LE audio, but has a key difference. That instead of being a connected link, it addresses that final issue of the one-to-one topology. It is a true broadcast, as Bluetooth are calling it, one-to-any technology. So you have one data stream, assuming a single audio channel, and an unlimited number of devices, assuming they are within radio range, can receive that signal. And the transmitter has no consciousness of how many devices are listening, so there's no device limit. Final point on this, it's worth mentioning Auracast is a trademark of the Bluetooth organization, so that is not our terminology, that is the blanket term for this new broadcast version of Bluetooth. Another few points worth mentioning, because inevitably it's a little bit complicated. Firstly, not all devices that implement Bluetooth 5.2 are going to feature either LE audio or Auracast or both. And just because you've got LE audio connected link doesn't mean you've got Auracast. And as we're rapidly discovering, we need to be quite wary about the term Auracast ready, which in my experience actually means Auracast not ready. That it's, I think it's marketing departments getting hold of the concept and running with it. What it normally means is that the chips in the device are capable of receiving and processing an Auracast stream. It does not apparently mean that anyone's written the software to make it work yet. And that is the key issue. And we had some fun at the hearing aid event recently with people saying, we're Auracast ready. And I said, we've got a transmitter over there, go on. And they said, well, when we say ready. So yeah, we want to just be a little bit aware of the hype around timescales and availability of compatible devices. So there are a few things that are of interest to us in the context of a broadcast assistive listening application. Firstly, like conventional Bluetooth, it is a universal open standard. I mean, it is proprietary, it is a brand, if you like, but it's not something that's developed by one manufacturer of product. And we've seen some similar kind of technologies deployed by individual hearing aid manufacturers, but they're limited, inherently limited, because they will never be universal unless you go sort of clipping on a receiver for that particular technology to another brand of hearing aid, which is a really clumsy approach. So being an open standard makes it universal, means that at some point in the future it's quite plausible that every hearing aid may well be able to receive an Auracast stream. It also means that we can expect to see a wide range of bring your own device receivers. So we've mainly been talking about hearing aids so far, and we are expecting to see this being the standard in hearing aids in the future. But other kinds of device that use Bluetooth will also be able to receive Auracast, and I think primarily there we're talking about wireless headphones and earbuds, but we've seen some other interesting applications, and I was hearing from a customer the other day that one of the early products that uses Auracast can receive, it's a loudspeaker product, can receive the stream, and it's got sort of LED party lights in it, and it can do sound to light, but it doesn't use a microphone, it uses a data stream to do the sound to light stuff, which is quite good fun. It's going to mean, because of the ability to use other types of receiving device, that it is more accessible to more people. So it may be that we're talking about a user who perhaps hasn't quite got as far as getting themselves a hearing aid yet, but would like a little bit of voice lift. We're also seeing demand for this kind of technology in environments where people want to cater for people with neurodiverse needs, who might want a more focused sound, free of distractions. They don't actually have a hearing difficulty per se, it's more of a focus thing, and they don't want to hear someone unwrapping a sweet, or Roz's phone going off, or anything like that in the middle of what they're trying to listen to. Sorry, Roz. I suppose this is a key difference, and the thing that we've tried all kinds of things over the years to overcome with Loop, but is an inherent limitation. It is going to be relatively easy to install. There's no getting away from the fact that Loop can be tricky from an installation point of view. And so this gives us this sort of double tick of easy to install, but it will go direct to hearing aids, asterisk, in the future. And critically, because of this new codec, it is really low latency. I just realized I missed saying something I meant to say at the very beginning, which was that we have an Auracast system running right now. If anyone wants to use it for assistive listening purposes, or just because they want to have a listen, I don't necessarily want to disrupt myself mid-session, but if you want to have a listen in one of the later sessions, have a chat with Daniel or myself, and we'll get you a receiver and some headphones or a neck loop, and you can have a listen and see what it sounds like. Of course, it's not all plain sailing. There are a few things to be aware of. The big one really is all about the rollout for compatible receiving devices. That today, the options on the market that you can go out and buy are pretty limited. We'll have a look at those more specifically in a moment. But we are looking at an extended timescale, an extended crossover period from the current technologies being our go-to, to Auracast being our go-to. So a recurring theme here is going to be, don't panic about this being on top of us in the next month or so, and having to change all our ways on day one. And I think we're also going to see a refinement of the methods for making connections. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail later, but it's viable, it's easy to use, but I think there's going to be some further improvements in that area over the years. the interesting thing from our point of view is that's really to do with the receiver manufacturers. It's nothing much to do with us. So it's going to be interesting to see how those receiver manufacturers develop that area over time. Speaking of receivers, I think I've already mentioned two types of receiving device, namely hearing aids and earbud and headphone products. But because those are relatively unusual at the moment, we're going to see most users of systems installed in the first year or two using a hardware receiver in the same way that we would see one used with, for example, an infrared or radio-based system. And then we'll probably see a gradual tail off in how commonly used those products are as people bring their own devices more commonly. There will probably always be a need for a small number of hardware receivers for people who don't have those. And it's quite interesting, for example, that the American equivalent of the Equality Act, the ADA, specifies a minimum receiver number based on venue capacity, even if it's a loop system, which in theory ought to be for many users receiverless. So I think we're never going to get rid of the hardware receiver backup option entirely. But to begin with, I should specify what these dates are. The first date column is when these devices start to become available. And the second date column is when we think they're going to become more or less universal. And we're looking into a crystal ball a little bit here. You'll notice that we're not expecting to see hearing aids with Auracast becoming universally available for perhaps a decade or so. And that's driven primarily by NHS rollout. Quite rightly, the NHS are a bit cautious about deploying new technologies. These things often cost more money and they want to carefully evaluate whether those represent good value for money. And then depending on the trust we're looking at specifically, the replacement cycle for devices is typically somewhere around 5 years, in some cases less, but in some cases more. And so our best estimate is perhaps around a decade before you can reasonably assume the majority of users will walk into a venue with an Auracast hearing aid. But it will happen probably quite a bit sooner for earbud and headphone products, that people perhaps turn over those devices a little quicker, they're buying them themselves. And we're also likely to see more devices available that are compatible faster in the headphone and earbud world than with hearing aids. So let's have a little look at what this looks like from a user experience point of view. And we'll start off looking at hearing aids. So it's likely to be available in devices almost universally within the next 5 years. From there, it's a matter of how fast is the rollout. GN ReSounds next year is the first Auracast equipped and properly Auracast ready, Auracast working hearing aid to market, and that's available to buy today. And something I discovered really quite recently, which I thought was interesting, was it's not even particularly expensive. I had assumed that, I hadn't checked, that it was going to be a kind of high-end device, but it's not particularly. And we'll get onto this in a bit more detail in a moment, but it's worth mentioning, though, that it only actually works if you've got a particular model of Samsung phone to establish the connection. So if you just buy the hearing aid on its own, it'll connect to ReSound's own sort of skinned Auracast transmitter product that you can plug into your TV at home, but you couldn't go out to a venue and connect to a universal Auracast system unless you've got a particular model of Samsung phone to manage that connection. And we'll touch on that connection method bit in a bit more detail in a moment. But linking back to that comment and what I said a few minutes ago about the method of making a connection, the simplicity of changing modes on a hearing aid to enable the telecoil is really yet to be developed. You are most likely going to be using a phone as the controlling device for the foreseeable future. So that's where we need to see a bit of refinement in that user experience. If we consider now other types of device, Samsung's, and they've got a bit of a mouthful of a name, Galaxy Buds 2 Pro earbud products. These were first to market Auracast equipped receiving devices, and they were often supplied pretty much free with, say, an S23. If you bought a Samsung Galaxy S23, at times there was a promotion, you got the earbuds for free. And they were using the phone as a controller for that connection. A key point, though, is that even though we're saying a phone is required, the audio is not going through the phone. There's a sideways connection between the phone and the earbuds, but the data stream goes from the transmitter straight to the device in or on your ear, and the phone is simply a controller. So we don't have that double hop of latency. And the phone is simply acting as a controller. At the moment, generally speaking, the experience for a user is like joining a Wi-Fi network. The graphics look almost exactly the same. You hit a button to scan for what's available, you get a list populated of options, you tap on one, and if it's secured, and security for Auracast is of course an option, it pops up a prompt to put in a passcode. So really the experience and the graphics and everything almost exactly the same as joining a Wi-Fi network. It's pretty familiar. And the complication at the moment is that most devices, most of the things that go in or on your ear, are not able to actually do that scanning themselves, or are not programmed to do that scanning themselves. They're reliant on the phone to do the scanning and then say, there's a stream called Stream 1, and this is the security passcode for it, and I'd like you to connect to it, please. That's probably, I'm going to see perhaps an evolution how this works. That may well not be how it works beyond the first tranche of products. It may well be there's a couple of stages of evolution of this connection method. The alternative approach is that if the device in or on your ear can do the scanning itself, or is set up to do the scanning, then you don't have to have an Auracast aware phone to do the scanning for you. All the phone's doing is sending a command that says, please scan, and tell me what you find, and it populates a list based on some text, and it's simply a very basic controller at that point. And on the next slide, we have an illustration of an alternative way of doing this. So we said earlier that the Buds 2 Pros were the first earbud product to market, but Sennheiser's Momentum True Wireless 4 earbuds are the first product to market which don't have to use a specific model of phone. So they've got the scanning built into the buds, and any phone can be a controller as long as you're using the app that goes with those earbuds. And it's the same app that's used to turn noise cancelling on and off and set EQ and so on. I think it's worth mentioning that this is going to be a kind of universal experience for the user. So if you've got a particular model of hearing aid or headphone or earbud, you'll be used to connecting that to a streamer connected to your TV at home, or a system in a theatre, or wherever it might be. But the experience is identical wherever you are. And one of the hurdles we've hit with the Wi-Fi systems is that because there are different products in the market, it can be a different app for every venue you go to. And it's a bit like getting your parking. You end up with a suite of different apps, and it's a bit more of a barrier than an identical method everywhere you go. So it is still kind of tech-based, if you like, but at least it is a repetitive process that users will get used to quite easily. Okay. So let's have a bit more of a look in more detail at some of the limitations. It's worth mentioning it's going to take a considerable amount of time to get the installation base of transmission systems built up. Today, there aren't any commercial transmission systems available to buy. As we'll briefly touch on in a moment, there is going to be one available soon. I bet you can't imagine who that's from. But that isn't out now, and the country and the world is not going to be flooded with Auracast installations within the first month. I mean, I'd love it if they were, but it seems unlikely. So as we talked about the receiver build-up, but it's going to take time for the transmitter base to build up as well. We're going to see, as I just hinted, a relatively slow build-up of the user's own devices. That's going to take an extended period of time, as we discussed earlier. And the fact that the user experience story is changing almost every month. I mean, the update for those Sennheiser Buds only came out about 4 or 6 weeks ago. Prior to that, it was always phone-based. It's changed very quickly, but the user device landscape is really still in its early days, and I think we'll see quite a few tweaks along the way and updates that change how that works. So it's early days, and there can be a downside to being an early adopter. And it's worth mentioning that until people are able to bring their own device, they are going to be tied to receivers, and that brings with it limitations in terms of where they can be used. So, for example, if you're only going to have a relatively short interaction, say at a reception desk, you don't want to be spending 2/3 of your time getting up and running with a receiver that the person hands you. You really need to work on a BYOD basis. And also situations where there isn't anyone to give you a receiver. And in the moment, this is really an argument we primarily apply to not using, for example, infrared in those environments and using loop instead, even if, let's say, in a theatre, the main house uses infrared. We should still prioritise loop at those customer service points. The same thing's true of Auracast as well, until people are able to bring their own devices. And it's also mentioning we're going to see probably a relative flood of very basic, low-cost, I'm going to call them dongle transmitters that are primarily designed for use with things like televisions. But they are going to be of limited value for a number of reasons. They're not going to be integrated with receiver options. It may well be tricky to manage security with them. We may well want to scale the power output of what we're doing. The control and flexibility of those devices, not to mention scalability, is likely to be very limited. So there's a risk there that the technology gets a bad name due to the simplicity of some of the basic devices. But the good news is there's going to be some salvation at hand. One of the main resolutions is just going to be time. We've got to let this technology mature, and probably there will be a few missteps along the way, especially, I suspect, from a receiving device point of view. I'll say we've already seen some examples of it with things that aren't properly implemented, and they're having to be firmware updates to receiving devices to make them properly compatible and that kind of thing. So it's going to take some time to mature. We obviously need to see those bring your own device receivers become available. I think if we're, let's say, using a phone as a controller, we could look at alternative ways of selecting or triggering a channel. So QR codes would be one possible example. And maybe an automated beacon approach so that you can walk into a room and the device is automatically triggered to select the correct channel. We're seeing that with the audio over Wi-Fi product that we sell. We think something like that could potentially be applied in this environment as well. But again, kind of down to the receiving device manufacturers and informal standards for what features people can expect in those. And then we may see alternative ways of establishing a connection other than a phone. One possibility would be to use NFC, the idea that you could almost sort of Oyster card scan on your way into a room and make that connection without having to get your phone out. Whether that was just with some kind of card or whether you could use a smartwatch or something like that. Again, the receiver manufacturers need to explore how that works. And for some devices, I'm thinking mainly hearing aids, you can still get tactile physical remote controls, and they're sometimes the things that have the microphone, remote mic type devices built in. It may well be that those can act as a controller as well. They may have a screen that's a bit more usable for someone perhaps with dexterity issues than a touchscreen phone, for example. So some interesting ideas about how we might be able to establish connections in the future. And going back to sort of the more transient environment, different types of transmitter product will help us equip more applications, and that's partly packaging, partly price point, etc. So the big question is Auracast the future? Well, and we don't say this lightly as a loop manufacturer, but yes, we think it probably is. If we're going to see it almost universally installed in hearing aids, and it's easier to install than loop, then it probably eventually overtakes loop as the default best user experience assistive listening technology. And that's because it's really the first viable alternative we've seen that is an open standard, low power consumption, low latency. It's the first option like that that's come to the market. And it might seem a bit strange that it's taken this long to replace this pretty old-fashioned technology in the form of loop, but loop does a very good job in its own way, and there've been an awful lot of technical hurdles to overcome to come up with something that really was viable to do that job. And eventually, we will undoubtedly see it replacing the telecore, but not for a long time to come. But that transition is going to be slow, and I think that's probably the the single most important point to make, that nothing's going to change overnight. I think pretty much the final thing to look at, and then I'm very happy to take any questions you might have, is, now I promised I'm not going to plug our product per se, but I think it might be useful, I'm going to look out for Rosa's laser glare, to actually show you sort of what this sort of thing might end up looking like. And that's the motivation here, rather than necessarily trying to take any orders today. So our product's going to be called Ori. And it's fundamentally a 2.4 gigahertz digital radio. And it has the same kind of propagation pattern as a Wi-Fi access point. So it sort of makes sense that you would want to mount it in the same way as a wireless access point, and hence it looks rather like a wireless access point. But yeah, it's a white box, and we feed it some power and feed it some signal, and off it goes. And you probably want to put that somewhere in the middle of the room, most likely ceiling or wall mounted. And you would, give it some power. Our product's going to be powerable via USB-C or PoE. We're going to have a couple of analog balanced inputs, mic line switchable, and a Dante option. So I suppose all fairly predictable stuff, really. We talked about receivers. We're going to be offering a hardware receiver, sort of infrared style receiver. And these are the devices we've got at the back that you can have a play with and listen to later. Neil is modelling one for us there. I'll expect the commission bill later. Yeah, this is going to be able to connect either to headphones or a neck loop, or possibly a Bluetooth Classic dongle if we've got compatible hearing aids to play with. And we've got various configuration options there in terms of the way this behaves and so on. But yeah, fundamentally very similar to an infrared style receiver. We've got a bit of a challenge there with this sort of device from a security point of view, because with a phone with its touchscreen, we can easily type in a passcode. We've got 5 buttons on this thing, and I think it would be a bit cruel to make people go A, B, C, D with the volume buttons, etc. So we're going to be managing security for this through a network-attached charging dock. And so the system control software will be able to assign passkeys to receivers in the docks. And that could be done on a static basis or dynamically. You could potentially have it tumble codes for each meeting if you wanted to. Some of these features are going to be implemented over time, but it's an example of the challenges we face around connection and managing security, that it's not 100% straightforward. And as is sort of inevitable with modern audio products, we've got some software to control all of this. So that manages the transmitters and the audio settings, but also allows us to manage things like security. So the whole thing's an integrated suite that works together. And that's again why I say we've got to be wary of these super basic products that are just like a plug-in dongle. Right, so the good news is we've got a magic word at the top there, summary, which means I'm about to shut up. In summary, I think Auracast is a really exciting development, and it probably does represent the future of assistive listening and will make everybody's lives easier for deploying this effectively for users. But it's not going to happen overnight, and in the meantime, there is a vital role still to play for loop, radio, infrared, and audio over Wi-Fi. And I think a sort of particular mention to, look, I've missed a quote, there you go, my PowerPoint animation is getting the better of me again. Loop is going to remain the go-to direct-to-hearing aid technology for the foreseeable future. Auracast is going to do a very similar job to infrared pretty much on day one. And you could construct an argument that says that for many applications it replaces infrared quite early on. Similar job, but it's got that future-proofing. But it is almost going to be a backward step, really, if we are currently planning to install loop, because we're going to go from a receiverless BYOD technology back into something where most people are going to be using receivers. So loop in particular still has a significant role to play for a number of years to come. And as if, don't take it from me, Chuck is, I think he was described a couple of days ago as the main man at the Bluetooth SIG. I'm not sure if that's how he self-identifies, but his quote was, "The coexistence of Auracast broadcast audio and existing assistive listening solutions is critical for hearing aid users." So they're the guys who came up with this idea, and they're saying the same thing. Right, good news is that's all from me. Very happy to take any questions you might have. But do wait for Roz and her magic roving microphone.
From an installer's perspective, what, if any, standards exist? You know, because there's plenty of standards for induction loops. Is there existing or emerging standards for installation, commissioning and testing guidance?
How did I know there'd be a standards question? So it's a little bit of a, I should add I'm not an expert on this subject, so I'll do my best. It's a little bit of a complicated situation because it's part of the Bluetooth standard, but obviously that is proprietary, it's not an independent standard. And my understanding is that the difficulty that, for example, the IEC might have is that they can't be specific about particular branded technologies, and so they've got to be quite generic with the guidance given. But having said that, I think they can equally apply some sort of general guidance which can influence how proprietary standards are developed. So my understanding is that with the help of some prominent and well-known ISCVE figures, there are a couple of different standards in the works. This is going to be influencing the, I can't remember the number, but there is a general assistive listening standard that I think already exists, but there's a revision on the way. I may have got that wrong, maybe fresh to, the first edition is yet to be published, I'm 100% sure. But provision to cover Auracast is going to be included in that. There is also another standard, I believe, and don't quote me on it, but hopefully I've got this right, which specifically looks at 2.4 gig systems, which my understanding is an attempt to cover this specifically without covering this specifically. Yeah, it's in the works, but it's all still very new, and the Auracast standard itself hasn't been out for long, and inevitably these things take time. One relatively neat thing is that unlike Loop, there isn't that much to it in terms of variation. So I think integrating design advice into a standard would be very useful. But there's a lot of detail in the Loop standard because there's quite a lot to go wrong and a lot to measure. Whereas a bit like I suppose infrared, this is a bit more binary, practically speaking. You plug it in and switch it on, and either you've got enough radio range or you haven't, and it either works or it doesn't, essentially. So there isn't as much to say.
Yeah, hi there. I apologise if I missed this along the line, but you talked about the phones being a way of controlling the interface, directly linking the Bluetooth to the headphones. But isn't it quite likely that the phones themselves will become receivers? Are they going to likely to be integrated with the Auracast Bluetooth so that's, in my opinion, sort of would reduce the rollout of the receivers or avoid the necessity for the receivers if it was built into phones at a much earlier stage?
It would be a really neat thing to have, especially if you could use wired headphones. I mean, one leap is to say if you could go in via Auracast to a phone and out via Bluetooth Classic, you unlock a whole load of legacy wireless headphones. You obviously are going to add Bluetooth Classic latency into that equation, but if you had wired headphones, you get around that. My understanding is that that is for reasons that are beyond my pay grade, technically very difficult from a phone design point of view. It may be possible in future devices, but it's not something that can be easily done with historic or even current generation phones. There's some kind of restriction. I'm not clear on the details there. So it would be a really obvious thing to do, but I think that's not going to happen imminently. But yeah, it would be nice if it could happen. But unfortunately, not looking great on that front.
You mentioned this is going to take some time to roll out the products the customer ends up using. What assurance is there that the transmitter technology currently available would be compatible with stuff in the future? I mean, you mentioned it's Bluetooth 5.2. When we get to Bluetooth 10 and the products for that, how is it going to be backwards compatible to current product?
I think there is a background concern that, and I'd argue that it's even more acute, for example, with audio over Wi-Fi. that as technology gallops and gallops, the life cycles for things shorten. So I think there's a very valid general concern on that front. One neat thing about, and again, I'm in danger of straying out of my expertise here, but about the underlying technology here is that the radios are software defined, so they are effectively reprogrammable, and we can make some quite substantial changes through firmware updates. So I think we're pretty confident that we're not going to see hardware becoming obsolete in the short term. I think perhaps another concern is, we're banking on a future rollout of devices. I mean, it looks from everything we're hearing like that's overwhelmingly likely to happen, but inevitably it is one of the risks of early adopting, that there is a possibility that things might not go, we don't really have a crystal ball, things might not go quite as we expect. But yeah, certainly there are some features we're expecting to see added to Auracast in the future, and we're not anticipating any problems with integrating those over time. So fingers crossed, no issues.
Okay, no more questions? Everybody good? I guess the whole Auracast thing, although we've discussed it very specifically in terms of assistive listening, you could see it much more widely used in sort of museum exhibit broadcasts and that type of thing. It has the assistive listening role, but I mean anywhere where you're after dialing in on a commentary, where you go around a museum or something and people give you stuff to walk around, it could be equally applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. It's something I didn't cover, but it is actually it's one of the kind of rays of sunshine, I suppose, from our point of view with it, that we've been very narrowly focused really on the world of assistive listening. But for example, Bluetooth SIG keep mentioning an example of an airport concourse, and you could attach yourself to the Auracast stream for your gate, and you could be in your own little world listening to your podcast or audio book, and then a broadcast comes up saying, your plane's leaving, go and get on it. And it sort of overrides that and prompts you to not miss your plane. So yeah, I mean, there is a general PA application for it as well, absolutely. And that potentially massively broadens the horizons for where the products could be sold from our point of view as a manufacturer.
Very helpful. Okay. I feel that we've got, I understand there's some challenge on getting the questions coming from the online environment. So if anyone online does have any questions, I'm talking to you guys out there, apologies for that. You can always give Ros a ring now and she'll answer you, to relay your question. Or contact us later and we'll field them to the relevant person. Okay, so exactly the same as the last hour. Big thank you for James. A most enlightening speech, and we'll see everybody back here at past. There's enough time for the same comfort and coffee break. See you in a sec. Right, last couple, please. Back in, take a pew. Yeah, I was going to say. And for the third and final session of the afternoon, I'd like to introduce Neil Voce. He's going to be talking to you about the registered installer scheme. I have to say, I wasn't originally going to be here for this event. I was going to be in America, but some of my colleagues are there at the moment, and I said, I can't go because last time I went to Washington was eight years ago, and Trump got elected, so I daren't go back in case it happens again. So it was. All I can say is it obviously wasn't my fault. So this is where I find out how much I've been stitched up by Ros and Sarah, who make these presentations for me. So I claim no previous knowledge of what might be on them. No. So what I'd like to talk about is is something we're calling the Registered Installer Scheme, which is here to improve visibility, marketing, and opportunities for the ISCVE members. And one of the things that is always brought to us as the institute and as the president or as the representatives of that is sort of people trying to actually ascertain what the return is in terms of what am I getting out of being in the institute. And we think there's a very long list, but one of the areas where potentially we didn't have quite so much visibility was actually where we were trying to work for our installer members, and that's something we wanted to try and put right. So, sort of heading back to the original tenets of the ISCVE, we're here to promote technical excellence. We're here to advance the science and technology of sound and communications, and we're trying to find new opportunities for our members. So we thought one of the ways of doing that was to ensure that the installations that are undertaken for the end user in their buildings would be undertaken by people who individually promote technical excellence, the advancement of science, and so on, and ideally are therefore ISCVE members. So that's roughly where that comes from, and why are we doing that now? What's the reason for thinking of it at this time in late 2024? If we dial the clock back a number of years, very much the situation was that our membership was very much based on the manufacturing companies. So they were our supporting member base, came from the manufacturers, and many of our actual individual members worked for those manufacturers. And as the last 5 years have come through, particularly driven by the ECS card scheme, what we've actually found is that the balance has very much shifted in terms of our members from being employed by manufacturers to being employed by installers. So we now actually have a large body of individual members who are employed in the installation field, coming to us for the ECS cards and so on. And that requirement for ECS cards, the fact that we've become more active in general, has meant that the ISCVE's profile, in fact, has been raised up, and therefore we've got a lot more members than we used to have overall. And one of the issues that we then faced as we crossed the 1,000 member mark was that our membership portal was kind of creaking at the edges. It wasn't terribly easy to use. It was kind of expensive to change and looked a tad dated, and wasn't really open to you guys, the members, to actually do very much in our website to talk about yourselves. So overall, we had a variety of reasons to actually upgrade, and we're changing from the existing system was Wild Apricot, and the future system will be HubSpot. So it's sort of a change of the sort of back office system that we're using to control the membership, and well, not control, that's the wrong word. We're not actually controlling the membership. We're managing the members within our environment. We're the control of their data as far as we need it. So I don't know if anyone already uses HubSpot, but it's a very active sort of marketing customer relations database tool. So we think it's changing that is part of our future growth. And again, talking again to the members that we have, both on the corporate and individual level, people have sort of said, how do I get more business out of being part of the ISCVE? How do I differentiate myself, attract business leads, and so on? So again, we see these questions raised time and time again by different people, in some installers expressing them as pain points and that type of thing. So again, we decided to make ourselves a new registered installer scheme. And we had some debate about what it was going to be called, the registered installer scheme. We started, there were discussions about an approved installer scheme, but reality is we're not policemen. So the concept of actually having an approval meant an approval process and regulatory stuff around that to make sure, and in all sorts of different things. So having debated at quite some length over that, we decided to go with a registered installer scheme. And so the registered installer scheme is effectively going to sit in the same place as the member, the supporting member area. So a supporting member may be a registered installer, or they might be a premium registered installer if they're a premium supporting member. I'm sure some of you have involved in the corporate side are aware of what those are and what the distinctions are. And how are we then going to actually look at what a registered installer is going to get? So we're going to change the website like we discussed, and on that website there'll be a much enhanced listing for the installer. That's going to give registered installers the opportunity to have a nice case study with some photos, to list out their specialist skills. We're going to have a lead referral system, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a bit. And there'll continue to be the same benefits as you previously had as a supporting member, as the discount on appearing at ISCVE, linked to the company websites. You're going to still get a printed plaque and certificate, document things, reduced fees for coming on the training courses. So I'm not going to go through all these because you can read them as easily as I can. But fundamentally, when you port from being an approved a supporting member to a registered installer, your benefits as far as this remain the same, but now with the added advantages for installers of having the ability to put your case study and your specialist skills listing on there, and to have the lead referral system. And we're still going to have the 2-tier system, so we will have the premium version as well, and the premium thing is just going to have basically the opportunity to list a couple more case studies. So instead of having one detailed case study, you'll be able to put 3 on there. The listing will be highlighted on the home page of the ISCVE website, again, in the same way that it is now for the supporting members. And that when we get these leads, business leads, then obviously they will also, the people who are premium members will also have some priority in terms of receiving those leads. So like we say, it's not really much of a change of anything that's being offered from going from being a supporting member to a registered installer or premium. We're just changing that over. So the enhanced public profile, which again, you guys are going to write it. We're just going to open we're going to open the website for you to put your information on. Is that you are going to be able to add company bio, the case study information, what project types you're particularly interested in. I accept that some people cover everything, but we're going to try and encourage people to be to list the things they're most specifically interested in, so other people can list the things they're most specifically interested in, rather than just, otherwise when you, in the end, you get to do a search looking for someone, you just get a whole plethora of names with little distinctions. So we're going to ask people to try and concentrate on their, their real core business. And we're going to split up the companies in terms of the typical budget size projects they are interested in and their region. And we've got sort of countrywide, district region, and potentially something a bit more granular. That's still, there's still some decisions that have to be made on this, and the granular thing might be specifically of interest for smaller companies. I know maybe you work in Bristol, and really that's actually where you'd like to do your business, and it's totally fine. You should say that rather than say I do the whole of the southwest because it's a damn long way from Bristol to Penzance. So this information is going to be available to each of the installers. And I'm glad to see that I think you will be able to read this, because these small text actually worried me quite a lot. So this is kind of how it's going to start to look. So we'll have some membership types, regions, skills and industries. And then on the right hand side, sort of top level discussion of your company name and so on, and what your little areas of interest are. And then you'll be able to get more information, which obviously then enables you to drill down into a screen for one particular company. So that then enables you to talk a little bit more about your company, what sort of size of business you're interested in, your geographic focus, any languages you happen to do. And then on the right hand side, that's giving you actual contact. So you can then actually contact that person directly through our website. And I think the key thing about that is that we're obviously also going to know that you've contacted them. So what's very important to the Institute is obviously linking members to potential end users, but also actually us understanding who we're linking to who, so that we're actually able to measure and track how successful our scheme is. And I think is there one more slide that goes in that set? Yeah, so that's again, it's just sort of looking at the drill down in terms of that. So again, picking out that when the person's searching, they are getting more and more the actual detail they're interested. So it will filter against the skills that people have actually chosen and the industries that they're actually working in. So yes. So the idea is to make something which is, clean, looks sort of 2025, hopefully, to everybody, and therefore enables the user to connect with the providers, and it enables us to track the engagement metrics so that we understand where we are being successful. So again, you get your biography, get all your data, get your contact form, and hopefully we can all make a success out of those links that we're making. Inquiry email sent. So we're going to get the emails, areas, and the success tracking. We're going to have a new logo. So doesn't look very different to the supporting member logo, but the same sort of red thing, but be the registered installer logo. Once you've become a registered installer, you'll be able to use that on your emails, website, so on and so forth. And I think the next bit is actually one of the important part about the registered installer. At the moment, we are aware that there's not an awful lot of people that actually go on to our website and search for suppliers, and then actually make that link through. I mean, we do get some. Ros would attest that we do get a number of people that go either through the website or actually phone up and are put in touch with people. But what we are aiming to do in 2025 is actually to have a budget to promote more widely the Institute and its members. So we have some databases. We have a database of around 12,000, 13,000 contacts working in government and council. Nearly 20,000. So we have a substantial database of people that we will be, getting in more regular contact with, to ask if they're, to promote this idea and to ask them to link through, tell them about our members and what they can do for them. And we also actually want to do some more end user focused exhibitions. We've discussed, for example, doing facilities management stuff, the Christian Resources exhibition, stuff through the AV user group, LTSMG. So we're conscious of the fact that we do have access to a lot of end user marketplaces, and we're not really utilizing that contact at this time. And by actually creating a marketing budget, attending some of these shows and emailing people on a more regular basis, we are genuinely hoping that we will generate engagement. back through to the website. We'll have a dedicated landing page back on it. So if you click through from an email, it'll go to the portal, but it'll know where you've come from and so on. So we'll actually again be able to track our success as an institute in attracting end user customers, which are then pushed through to installers. We're hoping that we'll be able to track, what areas people are interested in, what areas? I mean, what technologies people are looking to purchase, which area they're looking to purchase in, and the type of budget that they are thinking of spending. So it should start to give us, some real data, so that when we have institute members or registered installers coming to us and saying, talking to us about the value that the institute adds, we'll be able to say, well, in 2025 we put through let's say £5 million worth of project leads to 18 different companies in these particular areas, and that's the ambition, is to try and actually generate some business which we can measure and pass on to people that are supporting us. So hopefully it's a virtuous circle of helping people to generate business. So we don't want to make this too complicated as to who can be a registered installer. Again, the consideration about the approved installer, registered installer, what can we tell people to do, what can't we tell people to do, we have to take quite a light touch on this. But obviously, as a registered installer, this is really a company that uses ISCVE members as the installer engineers. So if you're getting your ECS cards from us, if you're that means that you're qualified by us to be the installer engineer. But also, we're not holding against someone who is just an ISCVE member, who's a sole entity doing their own projects. That's totally fantastic. No difference, and that sole person can be just as easily a registered installer as a large multinational company. And the standards, which actually you as individual members, you kind of already signed up to a bit of a code of conduct as part of the institute as to what you do, and so there's nothing in this registered installer's code of conduct that people haven't basically already signed up to. So it's not like there's some new complicated form coming through you've got to read and check with your lawyers or anything. But for the actual registered installer companies, we ask that they should typically employ or contract ISCVE engineers for installation projects, and that those installer engineers must be appropriately trained for the installations they perform. And I'm sure that this is the case for everybody in this room, and otherwise you wouldn't be here if you're not planning to use ISCVE engineers to do the work, and you wouldn't be interested in learning more about how to do your projects properly if you didn't bother training your engineers, because we all know that if you send out engineers who aren't trained, you end up having to go back several times and you make everyone unhappy. So again, we're not really asking for anything new in terms of what we're putting on you as an onus of responsibility, and that again was a little bit part of the trying to mediate between a registered approved policeman or just sort of managing the system. So that's kind of where we are with that. In terms of the code of conduct, if you didn't remember the details from before, the details are approximately that there is a clear process for managing complaints if there should be any complaints. So again, there is again in the code of conduct already the potential for a disciplinary or investigation process to resolve issues following a set procedure. And if anyone's interested in recapping what that is, I'd say it's already in the code of conduct, but you can always have a quick reread. So at the moment, in terms of supporting members, we have 83 companies as supporting or premium supporting members who contribute to the ISCVE's coffers every year, for which we are most thankful. And approximately 50% of them are primarily installers. So we will be asking the installers to transfer to the registered installer scheme. And I think we'll be giving them a little prompt. Ros will be contacting the people in order that we move over to the registered installer scheme quite quickly, with something we'd like to get done by the end of the year. And basically, pretty straightforward idea. There'll be an simple application form on the ISCVE website, and that will then just be checked by the team. And then once you've passed that extremely low threshold, given you're already here, it's not extremely low threshold if you're not already here, but you are already here. Then once you've done that, you'll then get a profile link, which is basically the gateway for uploading your information onto the website. And as soon as we are able, then the membership profile will be activated, making you visible to potential clients. So again, this is something we'd like to get done by the end of the year. It's not complicated, and we will be contacting the people we believe to be installers in order to help promote that. I mean, one of the issues that sometimes we have is that we don't always have the right contacts, but in the company. But I'm sure that's something we'll be working on over the next few weeks. What I suppose is sort of quite important to understand about this and the whole process here is that we are going to open the portal and the ability to upload better information to the manufacturers as well. So I don't want any manufacturers or non-installer supporting members feeling that they're missing out in any way. It's just that we only have the capacity to do like one thing at a time. And so the first thing that we want to concentrate on, because we feel they've been perhaps a little bit overlooked before, is to do this registered installer scheme. If we can get that all up and running by the end of the year, then soon, early into the new year, we'll then basically be sending the profile links to the existing non-installer supporting and premium supporting members, so they can also then improve their own visibility on the website. So that's kind of the aim as far as that's. We're not trying to do one thing for other people. So the scheme rollout. Applications for existing ISCVE members, that's thing one. Again, please, if you'd like to get on with it, get onto the website and say so accordingly. If not, Ros will be contacting you if we believe you to be an installer to encourage you to take this step. Upload all your information. In terms of some of the things that we are thinking about, such as the like the vertical marketplaces, the budget sizes, the geographical stuff, we've taken the best guesses that we can on that, but we would welcome extra input. If there's all of this stuff is being coded as we speak. Most of it's done. We have some sample data on there. But it's not cast in stone at this time. So if there are things that you think need tweaking, there's certainly a window of opportunity for making those tweaks in the first part of first between now and say the end of the first quarter of 2025. The launch, therefore, the ambition is for it to go live at the end of the year. So the portal will all look different. The website will look different. All this information will be on there. Ros has volunteered to work on Christmas Day to get it all done, and then really for next year, the ambition is very much to try and actually use the marketing budget to drive this engagement. Hopefully that's going to go meet with a great degree of success. So, you know, in the future we'll have both sort of leads that that are responses to activities that we've done, those activities being the combination of social media, but also actually attending some exhibitions and so on. And, you know, that's in the future, potential future developments, that's all part of, part of that working out the marketing scheme for 2025 and thereafter. So for those who are excited to get involved, really just make sure that we have the right company contact, so we know who we're talking to, the right person, and then to contact Ros. And at the end of all that's kind of it in terms of what we are doing for registered installers for 2024-25. Any questions?
Cost?
The cost is the same as the membership and the premium membership categories. So I think it's 375 for registered installer status and 495, I believe, for premium, which again is just the same as for the supporting member grades. So no additional cost for supporting members.
Hi, yeah. So with the search engine and things, when they go online and they put in the criteria, is that necessarily alphabetical? Because obviously WEAC never do quite as well as ambient systems when we come to the the search engines.
I'd like to think. Yeah, no, Jeremy, I feel your pain there. I mean, as a man who always went to lunch last when I was at school, I'm aware of the negativity of being associated with the wrong end of the alphabet. No, it won't be done like that. The idea would be very much more to target the person that most closely matches the customer requirement, regardless of their place in the alphabet.
I think you should be able to do. You probably do you'll probably be able to do it alphabetically if you want to, but you won't. Oh, good. I'm glad you said that.
Any more questions? Oh. Well, that's easy then. I'm pleased with that. That's gone more smoothly than I thought.
Essentially, the barrier to entry is just pay the money. That's right. Well, I can make up. I mean, I was being slightly flippant, but so I mean that's important because you were saying it's not an approval scheme; it's a registration scheme. It's a service you're providing the installers in order to provide a website that they can be searched for effectively under.
Yes.
There's nothing. So we shouldn't expect installers to start saying using this as a look, use us because we're one of the registered installers. That gives you an advantage. That gives you some sort of suggested. Implied.
I would say that the value of the registered installer and you promoting the registered installer is that you are in a way from a legal point of view you're sending all your installers out with ECS cards, which I believe is a legal requirement. Secondly, you have actually agreed to a code of conduct in terms of the way you behave, and you've kind of undertaken to only use IS or to give the relevant ISCVE level of engineer who's been appropriately trained to do the work. So I feel that it gives you a grounding as being a professional within your field if you're an ISCVE, a registered installer, even if we are a bit shy of calling it an actual approval process. It's still it still gives you a degree of credibility, I believe.
Yeah, fair enough. That would suggest that there are circumstances in which an installer would be refused entry, as it were, effectively. Unlikely, it seems.
Like I say, if you've signed up to the code of conduct,
exactly.
Exactly. If you don't want to sign up to the code of conduct, you won't be allowed in.
Well, you mentioned about having to have ISCVE members as your installation engineers. That might not be universal in every company.
No. We accept that isn't a universal case that every person that ever goes on to a site and acts in an installation capacity is an ISCVE installer. I mean, there are many people that may, I don't know, for example, pull a cable from A to B who, you know, they're much better off really being a member of electrical contractors than they are needing to actually worry about what's going on the end, how you connect it up, or how you commission a sound system or set a signal to noise ratio. So, you know, we can't say that every part of every installation has to be done by an ISCVE member, but we would like to think that at the bit at the end where you're taking a competent person and certificating a system for use, for example, in an emergency situation or whatever, we'd like to think that your suggestion of the competent person is in fact competent. You know.
Yeah, so and I know you've deliberated about this because you did explain, but the word installer does sort of limit the scope of it a little bit, because obviously we've got designers and things that people are going to be searching for, purely design. You've got your manufacturers. I mean, us particularly keen on the maintenance side. So people looking for those sort of trades are less likely to look at the installer. And I'm wondering why you have the word installer at all, and why we're not just ISCVE registered companies. But I know you've deliberated about that. So
yeah. I think maintenance is an interesting point, because it doesn't like you say, it's not necessarily installation, but maybe that needs to be one of our specialist, one of the specialist trades within our list of, are you maintainers, an interesting point. I think when we add on and we bring the manufacturers into the same type of window, then one of the points that I don't know in my head, and I stand to be this stands to be wrong, I guess, is that when we go to the Christian Resources exhibition or facilities management exhibition, the people we're trying to put those people in contact with are service providers to end users. And if we look at the people that we have who are manufacturers, we effectively almost see our membership as their customer to some extent. And admittedly, there are people outside our membership who obviously are their customers, but I suppose in our simplistic thinking, the end user is after someone who is notionally known as an installer, and the manufacturer is also basically after an installer, but from a different point of view. So I think we're going to keep a little bit of separation between those two. Designers is an interesting point. Maybe we should think about how to incorporate that, but that's the way we see it at the moment. But like I say, I don't think we're going to try and divide it so you can't. There's like some sort of Berlin Wall between this and the other. It should be flexible to see everything. But
the word integrator, which sort of covers all.
Yeah, integrator.
But yeah, I realise it's
Yeah.
fair enough.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It falls on my shoulders to thank you guys once again for coming. To thank Ros and Sarah for all their work in organising it. To thank our other speakers, Tony and James. To thank Daniel at the back for the sound engineering and so on and so forth. And as always, to thank Shaw for the use of the Rose Shaw Centre. I did notice they won some lovely award at the AV Awards for Microflex something or another last week. So congratulations on winning that too. I'm sure the ISCVE will be back to use your facilities again because we like it here. Thanks very much to Rose Shaw. And finally, thanks all for coming, and hopefully there may be some lunch now for people to consume.